Okay, so I'll just start off. When we're talking about seed saving, there's a few different things that people think about instantly. And the first one is the genetically modified seeds. And that, we're not going to get into that discussion. So that's when actual genetic material from another species or another type of creature has been scientifically inserted into the genetic material of the seed. Don't save those, don't plant them, stay away. Most of the seed that you can buy, or much of the seed that you can buy, will say contains no genetically modified organisms. So that's a good thing to be aware of when you're buying seed. But the seeds that are genetically modified that are starting to work their way into the stores where we could purchase them are sweet corn. That's going to be the next one. There's not a lot of seeds that consumers can buy that are genetically modified, but there are starting to be some. So it's definitely something to keep on the top of mind for sure. And then the other thing that we're going to talk about are hybridized seed versus open pollinated seed. And hybrid seeds, often people will confuse genetically modified seeds with hybridized seeds. But they're two very different processes. Hybridization is actually something that's been happening for a very, very long time. And it's a process whereby, using careful plant breeding practices, and we'll talk a bit about what that looks like, you get a different kind of variety. And the way that you can tell, this is a package of Brussels sprouts, and if you read the package carefully, at the bottom here it says F1, and that means it's a first generation hybrid variety, and sometimes you'll get F2, but usually it's F1. So if you see that on a seed package, then you know that it's a hybrid plant. It is not impossible to save the seed from a hybrid variety, but it is significantly more difficult. So we're going to actually leave that one aside for the moment as well. So if it says F1, we're just going to leave it for the moment. If you look closely at other packages, this one, beans, it has got an OP, which of course is open pollinated. So they'll typically say OP, so I've got some Swiss chard that also says OP, and these ones are easier to save seed from than something that's a hybridized plant. So what we're going to be talking about today is saving seed from open pollinated plants. Definitely a good starting point. So when we're talking about why it's important to save seed, there's a whole bunch of different reasons, and often the commercial varieties of seed that you can get in the store are the same varieties that commercial producers would use on a larger scale farm. And often, not always, but often those varieties are bred for very specific traits. So the broccoli is bred so that it will all be ready on the same day and can be harvested by machine. And for a backyard gardener, you might actually not want every broccoli to be ready on the same day because it's really hard sometimes to eat 12 heads of broccoli in a day. Instead, you want the broccoli to be ready, one every few days so that you can enjoy it over a period of time. And you don't care if it is able to be harvested by a machine because chances are in your backyard garden you would never have a machine to harvest it anyways. So the traits that backyard gardeners want are often different than the traits that larger scale producers want. Now, there are some smaller scale seed producers tend to have a lot more variety and a lot more sort of heirloom varieties of plants that are more typically what backyard gardeners would be interested in. So tomatoes are a really typical example as well. Tomatoes that are commercially produced transport really well and can be harvested really green and then ripen as they're traveling, which is not very delicious and isn't something that really matters for home gardeners. You want that most delicious or quirky colored tomato that isn't necessarily just that red, hard piece of cardboard that sometimes we get. So when you're able to save seed in your backyard, you're really able to start to play with those varieties and figure out what works best for you in the space that you have, the varieties that do better in your microclimates. Everyone's yard is slightly different, and different varieties will thrive in different places and areas, and so it's really important. Now, we had a bit of a discussion about this earlier, and this is a fabulous example. So Kelly brought in in these seeds, and these are pea seeds, and they were planted from saved seed last year, and there is a combination of snow peas and snap peas. We don't know what they are, and we don't know which is which really, and they all kind of look the same. And at this point, you know, you have a basket full of seeds, and you now don't know what it is. So if you're thinking about saving seed in your garden, labeling really carefully what variety things are. Peas, knowing that it's peas is not enough, because now we've got all of these lovely peas, which may or may not be something that we don't know. And there's nothing worse than thinking you have a snap pea and it's a shelling pea and you bite into it and you know, it's not a pleasant surprise. So labeling, I can't stress enough how important labeling varieties is, particularly if you're going to be sharing seed with anybody. Beans are a really easy thing to save seed from, but there's a big difference between pole beans and bush beans, and it's really hard to tell when you're just looking at the seeds. So knowing really really clearly what variety, what, you know, is it a pole bean, is it a bush bean, what is it called? Keeping all that information is really important. So labeled packages are great. Sometimes these get gross and really messy, and I'll sometimes write on little pieces of yogurt container or Venetian blinds. Old Venetian blinds make great tags. You can write on those, like stick it in if it's in a bag or whatever, so that you have a really clear, you know what it is that you've got. Often you can have seeds that look virtually identical and they turn into very different plants. And we talked about the bush beans versus the pole beans, you know, purple cabbage, green cabbage, kale, cauliflower. All of those plants basically look the same, and I think I've got a picture somewhere. Oh, never mind. I'll get to it eventually. They look very much the same. They look very much the same. The seeds are the same, and they turn into different plants. And so knowing what you have, you can really use that to plant actually what you want in your garden. So those are just some things to keep in mind. So we've already talked a bit about genetically modified plants versus hybridized plants. And so I'm not going to go into the GMO bit too much, but you can see how hybridization happens. You have two parent plants. So you've got a pollen parent and a seed parent. And in this case, you're taking, obviously, the pollen from one plant and using that to fertilize the other plant that will produce the seed. So this has been happening for thousands of years, and people have been very carefully selecting plants, cross-pollinating them. You often hear about Mendel's experiments with peas and all of those kinds of things. And so this is a process that we all will continue to practice, and it is easy for gardeners to practice in their home gardens if they're feeling adventurous and wanting to get into creating new varieties of plants. But I won't get into that too much more now. But we'll start with a little bit of flower anatomy. This is like the basics, just to get you started. Now, this is what is called a perfect flower. So it has both male parts and female parts. So the stamens, or these are the pollen-producing bits, would be the male parts. And the ovule and the carpels would be the female bits. There are certain plants that have male plants and female plants. Can you think of any examples? Kiwi. So kiwis, you will have one plant that produces the fruit and the other plant that produces the pollen, and without both of those, you don't get any kiwis. There are plants like marijuana is the same. There's many different plants that are like that. Some plants have male and female flowers on the same plant. Can you think of any? Squashes are the perfect example. And unfortunately, I packed all my books and sent them away, so I don't have my pictures of, I think there's probably some in here at some point. So knowing what kind of plant it is that you're dealing with and how that plant works is really helpful in determining how you're going to save the seed and whether you can save the seed and how that's going to work. So just keep this in mind. It's like grade 9 science or whatever it is. Bring it back, and we'll refer back to this as we go through. So again, we've already talked about the hybridized versus open pollinated, and here again you can see the beets are open pollinated and the Brussels sprouts are hybridized. I have never seen Brussels sprouts that aren't hybrid, and I have never seen Brussels sprout seeds. So I would say, don't bother with Brussels sprouts. Okay, so we're going to now talk about open pollinated plants, and these are plants that are true to type generally. Having an open pollinated variety does not mean that it won't cross with other varieties of plants, which is...
That's the other issue, these peas.
Yeah.
How do they...
Well, peas, so I'll get into that more, because peas actually are fairly... I'll get into that in just a second. So if you have open pollinated kale and open pollinated broccoli, they can still, or two different varieties of open pollinated kale, they'll still cross and become something slightly in the middle. And that is because within the open pollinated category of plants, you have inbreeders and you have outbreeders, basically. So that, well, I guess, or sorry, I should say self-pollinating and cross-pollinating. And that is sort of an adaptive strategy of different plants. So I'm going to start, I always forget to keep my slideshow running with as I'm talking along here. But so self-pollinating plants are generally complete or perfect flowers, so they have both those male and the female parts that we were talking about earlier. And the pollination tends to happen before the flower opens, and so that can be, you know, just within that flower, the pollen is there, all of the bits that are needed are there, pollination happens, flower opens, it's already pollinated, so the bees and the pollinators and the wind doesn't affect what will be produced. And crossing tends to be rare. There are always exceptions, and there are always weird things that happen, and mutations, and all of those quirky things, and that's just sort of part of the mystery of nature, you know? There will always be exceptions to every rule. But generally, with self-pollinating, open-pollinated seed saving, what you take off the plant will be the same as what you planted, more or less. And so peas are self-pollinating, well, if it's an open-pollinated variety. Peas, beans, tomatoes most of the time, garlic, those are all examples that fall into that category. So for the first time that you're ever saving seed, that is an excellent place to start. Now, we were talking about these peas earlier. So typically, if you plant a snow pea, you're going to get a snow pea, as long as you have it carefully labeled and you know what you're getting. And it won't cross too much, even if you plant 20 varieties of peas right beside each other, and you save all 20 varieties and plant them again next year, you'll be able to have 20 varieties of peas. So that's as long as you label them carefully and know what you're harvesting and what you're planting. So that's a fabulous place to start. Beans are the same thing. Tomatoes are, you save the seeds slightly differently, but tomatoes are the same thing. Same thing. So you can have, you can plant 20 tomato plants, and you can save the seed from all of those 20 tomato plants. They're a little bit more likely to, you know, they may cross a little bit more than, say, a pea, but they tend to be fairly stable. So, have you ever saved tomato seeds before? Once. Was it successful?
Yes, the tomato didn't do so well, but I think it's because I was in a pot. But it was a tomato from the market that was beautiful, and I had to have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tomatoes, if you're saving seed from tomatoes, they're different than most of the other seeds that you would save. You actually have to ferment the seeds so that they will be able to germinate the next year. And the reason is, if you picture a tomato, and I have so many tomatoes, I don't know why I didn't bring one in to actually do this, but if you picture a tomato and you picture cutting a tomato in half, and inside there's all of the seeds and it's nice and gooey, and you picture that tomato in a nice hot sunny spot where it was growing on the plant, and you think of what seeds normally like in order to germinate, and they want it moist and they want it warm, and that's essentially what the inside of a tomato is. They actually, you know how when you cut the tomatoes, they've all got a little gelatinous sac around them. And in that, part of the role of that is to suppress the germination of the seeds, so they don't all just sprouting while they're still inside the tomato plant. So the way that you save tomato seed and make sure that you have really good germination rates is to take all those seeds, squish them out into a jar or a container, add a little bit of water, cover it up just with a loose fitting lid or something so that you don't get flies in there, and let it sit on your counter for a few days, and it will start to ferment, and it will get gross and moldy on the top, and that's okay. You just have to embrace the disgusting mold. And then when you pour that off, that outer casing around the tomato will have fermented away, and you can rinse them off, dry them out, and then store them, and they'll be ready to go for next year. So that key step of fermenting the tomato seeds is very helpful in keeping high germination rates. You can save the seeds without doing that, but you'll have less success as you're planting them out in the following year. So if you plant 10 tomato seeds instead of all 10 growing, you may get 4 or 5 or 3 or however many that grow. So that's the tomato planting trick. Lettuce is another self-pollinating plant. So did I bring lettuce? I didn't have any lettuce today. Lettuce is really easy to save the seed from. It'll get really tall. It'll start to look almost like a dandelion fluff at the top. And because the plant is really bendy, you can actually just take a bucket, bend the top of your plant into the open bucket, give it a whack, the seeds will fall out with their little fluff right into your bucket, and you can do that every couple of days. As the seed dries out and is ready to go, then you can just collect it in a bucket. And you will get 10 million seeds from every lettuce plant, so you don't have to let everyone go to seed. With lettuce, people often ask the question, if I'm saving seed or if I'm growing a plant and I want to save the seed, can I still eat it? Often, once a plant starts to go to seed, you will be able to tell. I'm going to go back here for a minute. You'll be able to tell. This is a fairly atypical looking garden, and this is entirely a seed-focused garden. And so you can see this is all actually lettuce in the foreground here. And you can see a lot of different varieties of lettuce, and it gets really tall. Plants, when they're going to seed, tend to get big. They tend to take up a lot more space, and lettuce is the same thing. And most plants, when they start going to seed, will get really bitter, particularly the lettuces and things like that you would eat the leafy greens. They're not very delicious once they start going to seed. So probably if you're trying to save seed, you'll have to designate certain plants and just let them go. Whereas with a tomato, obviously, because the seeds are growing in the tomato, it makes no difference for what you're eating. But with a lettuce going to seed, it does not make a delicious salad. And then peppers, technically peppers can cross-pollinate, but I've had really good luck saving pepper seeds. Insects can play a bit of a role in some crossing, but I've saved a lot of pepper seeds and never had any problems. So usually in all the books they're classified as cross-pollinators, and I just save them anyways, and they're all spicy and delicious, and it doesn't seem to really matter. Okay, so now we'll get into the cross-pollinating plants, and here's a really great photo. You can see the difference between the female flower and the male flower, and the ovary of the plant is what becomes the fruit. And so that's very obviously a patty pan squash that will mature once it's pollinated, and the male flower looks very different. So the squash is a great way to see the difference between those male and female flowers. So cross-pollinating plants must exchange pollen in order to be fertilized. And they have either separate flowers, male and female flowers on the same plant, like the squash, or on different plants.
So with squash, it can be the same plant?
It can be the same plant.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It can totally be the same plant.
Does it seem stronger when there are multiple plants?
Yes. So this is always a question. How many plants do you need in order to save seed? And it is possible to save seed from the same plant, but just like humans, when humans reproduce, if there is no genetic diversity, there can be problems and people tend to not be as healthy. So there's a reason why we don't marry our siblings, generally. With plants, it's the same thing, and so the more genetic diversity there is, the stronger your seed is going to be. And so the more plants that you can have, and that you can save seed from, the better off you're going to be. Now, again, with the self-pollinating plants, it's not that important because they're self-pollinating anyways. But I still try, if I'm saving seed from a pea, I always try and save seed from more than one plant. So making sure that because within those plants, even if there is the same variety, there'll be some diversity there. With tomatoes, always trying to save seed from more than one plant, because again, those mutations can happen, and there's always some, genetics are funny things, and so there's always a little bit of variability, and keeping the genetic pool broad is a good tactic. It can be very hard for space, because often we don't have enough space to grow enough. Corn is a really typical example. Now, corn is a cross-pollinating plant, and it pollinates by wind. And in order to save the seed from corn, the sort of general rule of thumb that seed savers use is that you need to have about 100 plants of that variety in order to keep that genetic diversity. You can always save seed if there is less, but what usually happens is a process called inbreeding depression. So over time, the vitality and the vigor of that variety, that if you're saving the seed over and over again from a very small pool of plants, the vitality and vigor will decrease over time. And so that variety is important in summary. Now, cross-pollinating plants are often pollinated either by insects or by wind. So I mentioned the corn is typically wind pollinated, and these are typically insect pollinated, the squash. And the seed from these plants is more difficult to save because they are designed to cross. And so now, cross-pollination. Now this is something that often people struggle with. So if you have a zucchini plant and these are two different varieties and they're cross-pollinating, that does not affect the fruit that's forming on the plant. So it'll still be, if you have a black beauty zucchini and it's pollinated with something else, it will still be a black beauty zucchini. When you plant the seeds that mature inside of that zucchini the following year, they will become something else. They will become whatever they'll a cross between a black beauty and a whatever else happened to be spreading its pollen around. But it won't affect the fruit that's being produced this year. It affects the future
So that's not
generation.
true of corn, though.
Well, yeah.
Because if you have grinding corn and sweet corn, it is nasty when you get pollen from the grinding corn.
Yeah, and I've talked to a number of people who have had that experience where it changes.
It affects the quality of the corn kernel.
Of the corn kernel, yeah, which seems odd to me.
But it does, so it's different than squash.
Do you know more about corn? I know you know more about corn.
A little bit about corn, but I assume it's a more equal with how it treats its genetics.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to look into that because I've heard a number of people.
Now maybe because the corn is not a fruit per se, it is the seed. Maybe that's
right.
Maybe it's the seed that's different.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah,
sure.
Because it is the seed.
It is actually the seed. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense because if you have
so the starches and things reflect the parenthood of the.
and if you have a mutation in a bean, for example, this generation of bean is different.
Oh, okay, so yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
so that that makes sense.
Okay, that's fine.
I was like, oh no. Glad we figured that out. So, with the exception of corn, because it's not a fruit and it is actually the seed. There we go. So we talked about inbreeding depression, we talked about cross-pollinating. Did you have a question?
Just with the squash, if you want to save seed from your
Yes.
squash,
Yes.
are you going to say some more about that?
Yes.
Okay.
So, the question is, will it cross? It's the perfect segue. Will it cross, and how can you save seed even if you know it will cross? And the secret is in the Latin name. So you've got the genus and the species, and these are both the same genus, but they're different species. And within each species, you can have multiple varieties. So an acorn squash will cross with a crookneck squash, a spaghetti squash, and a zucchini, but it will not cross with a butternut squash and a Hubbard squash. And so I have a fabulous book that is packed and gone away, which I would love to show you, that goes through all of the different genus and species names of all of the different major families, so that you can figure out, and a quick Google search would tell you that, like, Latin name of whatever variety it is that you want to know. So if if you wanted to save seed and you were careful in planting your garden, and you planted an acorn squash and a butternut squash, or a couple of acorn squash and a couple of butternut squash would be even better, you would know that those two wouldn't cross with each other. Come on through. And so that would be the first step in saving seed. It gets more difficult when you're in an urban setting, because you have no control over what your neighbor is planting. So if you're being really careful in your own garden about the varieties, and just over the fence they've got everything, then you're going to have some additional challenges. But you can sort of get around that. If you want to save seed from a specific variety, you know what variety it is, so you've carefully labeled everything, you know what you've got. If you take a male flower, and if you just rip off all of the petals, just the pollen will be exposed. And if you find a flower that's like at that stage that has not opened yet, you can just rip off the tip of that flower and use this lovely magical pollinating wand, sort of dip it inside there, pollinate the plant, take a piece of duct tape and tape it over the top of this flower so that no insects can get in, nobody else can, their wind is not going to pollinate it. It's, you know what pollen has got in there, you know it's the only pollen that's gotten in there. The flower will eventually fall off. You will carefully mark the specific fruit that you have taken the time to pollinate. So you can actually take a little something sharp and you can write seed right into the skin of the fruit, and as it matures that will stay, and that works particularly well in winter squash. And it's actually a really great, we used to decorate them for, like, you'd write kids' names in them and do little drawings on the immature pumpkins, and then as they grow those scars stay, and it's a kind of a neat, just fun activity. But you can also write seed and know that way that is your specific pumpkin or squash or zucchini that you're going to save.
So is the taping more of a precaution, or like it's
No.
not a first come first serve sort of?
It's
like the first matching of genes. That's not what's gonna.
no, because if more
necessarily
pollen gets
take-
in there,
it's all.
so
So all the seeds that will form might have different pollen particles.
I'm not sure.
Okay. I mean, because
But it's not first come first serve.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I don't actually know how to answer that question, but I do know that you don't want other pollen
It's not
to
like
get
a
in
mammal.
there. No, it's not like a mammal. It's more like, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that if you don't tape it up, then you can get other things. And whether everything will be the same thing or whether it will be a mix, I'm not sure, because I have never planted
Well,
a
you
bunch
have
of
to
seeds
plant
and compare
from
what
the same-
comes.
yeah.
Yeah, and I haven't done that, so I'm sure you could read it somewhere. I also haven't done that.
So you have to do that pretty early in the morning when the flower just opens.
Yeah, just
Get in
before
there
it
right away.
opens, you know, and so it's an early morning activity. Flagging tape works really well to tie around the stem, or scratching into just making sure that you've marked it really well, and then you can leave it out in your garden until the plant dies down, and you know that the pumpkin or the squash or whatever it is fully mature. That zucchini, if it's a zucchini, a summer squash, you're gonna let it get really big. You want it to be as mature as possible. With seed saving, you always want to leave the seed on the plant as long as possible. And the best time to harvest seed of, say, a pea is when the plant is brown and crispy and dry. And with pumpkins and squash, you want to leave it until you know that all of the genetic material from the plant has had time to travel into that seed. So when the plants die down and that the plants are dead, there's no more genetic material that's still being transferred to those seeds, and that's the time that you would harvest them. So always leaving things on the plant as long as possible. So strategies for, I don't have a slide for it. So strategies, because we live in an urban setting and you can't always, bees fly an awful far way, and so you can't always ensure that there's not going to be other people growing things that will cross. But there are so isolation is one way that seed savers will protect their crops. You can use things like screens or barriers so that insects can't get in. So sometimes seed savers will have screen boxes that they'll put over certain plants to ensure that there's no insects coming in. So they would do that before the flowers open, so they can ensure that there's none of that pollen transfer. Sometimes you'll see people like bags over certain parts of plants, and that for that same reason. So it's a barrier, insects aren't getting in, the wind can't pollinate because there's a cover. And then again, the hand pollination that we talked about is another strategy. So even though we live in an urban place and it can be hard to make sure that things aren't going to cross, those are some of the strategies that you can use. And there's lots of information about all of that on the internet. If you Google hand pollination, you'll get really great photos. Okay, so I'll talk a little, you can't actually even read that at all, but it says harvesting and processing. Oops. So how do you, and I had you had asked the question earlier about how many do you need? And so how many plants do you need in order so I talked about corn, 100 plants. So for cross pollinators or outbreeders, 100 plants is a good number. You're never going to have 100 squash plants unless you have a huge farm, but if you're hand pollinating anyways, you can get away with it. And for inbreeders, 10 to 20 plants is a good number. So a lot fewer, but you're still maintaining that genetic diversity. So again, with harvesting, in an ideal world, whatever seed you're saving will completely mature on the plant. So so I already talked about how you would save tomatoes, but things like tomatoes and peppers, when the seeds are actually contained within the fruit, that's not going to dry out. It's never going to dry out. You want to leave it on the plant as long as possible. That train is so noisy. You want to leave it on the plant as long as possible, so it's just like a tomato plant would be just beyond where you would actually want to eat it. Like it's sort of starting to get a little squishy. It's not, it's a little overripe. So same with peppers. You would leave them on a little bit longer. Anything that is fruiting like that, you would leave it. The zucchinis, they're going to get huge. They would not be very tasty anymore. But again, you're leaving it on to fully mature, and again, so all of that genetic material can transfer.
So I have a question about
Yeah.
that. So if you were to do that to your zucchini, then it would stop producing little guys. So you kind of have a tendency to do it to the late, once you're fed up with zucchini, right?
Yeah.
But does that affect the timing of your vegetables in subsequent generations if you were to do that?
In subsequent, if you're...
So likewise,
No.
your peas, you're going to you're going to be harvesting the peas that decided to produce later in the
So
season.
there's different ways that you can deal with that. And when you're saving seed, you always want to save, and this is so hard, you want to save the biggest, most beautiful, best looking, most delicious,
and if you want the earliest
prime,
and the then
if you, but zucchinis are a little bit different because they're, you know, you could save from the first fruit that comes off, or you could save from a fruit that comes off later. That isn't as much of a difference as if you're saving from a plant that didn't produce at all until much later. Right. But there are different strategies. So say you have, this is a trellis and you're growing peas and you've got all these beautiful vines. Ideally what you would do is, instead of picking and picking and picking until there's nothing left and then leaving what's left to dry and then harvesting it all, if you can take a section and like flag it off, wrap it in flagging tape, and not harvest anything from it at all, that would be ideal. You're getting, you know, say you have 20 plants in that area, you've got enough space, and you just don't harvest that at all. Then you're getting the prime.
So that is better than going, oops, we missed that one, just let it go.
That is better, yeah. Because chances are if you missed it, it's probably not like the biggest, most beautiful pea. The other thing that you can do is, on this whole, as it's producing peas, you could take, you know, if you have a smaller area and you're just going to save a few seeds, you could, this is hard, especially if you have children, take flagging tape or some sort of marker and mark specific pods and say, these are like the earliest, biggest, best ones, and just mark them. Tell everybody in your house that if they pick those peas, they're, you know, going to be in trouble, and then save those ones. So it's, you know, it's a bit of a toss-up, and sometimes there's that, do I save it for seed or do I eat it? Do I save it for seed or do I eat it? Because again, like with the lettuce, you can't really do both. And lettuce will do better if you let a head mature, let it go to seed, than if you're harvesting, and then letting it go at the very end. So it's sort of finding the balance that works for you. And often, if you have a small space, there's gonna have to be a bit of give and take, and you know, you're gonna harvest the zucchini before you let one go to seed, and you're gonna.
Or you say, okay, I'm gonna do this for a few years with this batch of seeds, and then I'll get a fresh start.
Totally.
That's sort of how I do it. But
yeah, totally. Yeah, that works for sure. With things like peas, you want to wait until it's crispy, dry, and there is no moisture left in this at all. And
is it okay if the pod's still green?
The pods, if the stem that's attached to the pod is dry and crispy and brown, then you know there's nothing else getting to that pod, and then it's fine. If you can let it dry on the plant, totally, that's the best. If sometimes you can't, and if it's at this stage, like this is already really brown and dry, and this is a little bit green, it's still a little soft, and as long as you let it dry out the rest of the way, it's not going to be.
Yeah, I think those would be like these more wrinkly ones.
Right.
Is how they end up.
Yeah. I'm not actually sure.
Yeah.
What about mildew on it?
So
that's a problem with these.
Yeah. So once you've taken, so say peas, we'll continue talking about peas for a while. So what we've done here is taken those peas and laid them out in a nice, it doesn't need to be sunny, but dry area with airflow. These are on screens, so they're not sitting in a closed container. You want them open. I try and use paper bags rather than plastic because that'll hold the moisture in. You want to get as much of the moisture out as possible because we live in a climate and a part of the world where mold and mildew and all of those things that love moisture, they're everywhere. And so the drier you can get things, the better. If you have it in a container like this, making sure that you're moving it around so that there's nothing staying green at the bottom and just mixing it up. I'm trying not to mix the varieties here. And again, at every stage, keeping things labeled so that you know exactly what you've got in there. And again, we don't know exactly what we've got in here, but when they're in their pods, keeping a label with them. When you take them out of the pods, keeping a label with them. When they're still in the plants, labeled in the ground. So that's the sort of number one key piece of seed saving. So again, just another shot of a seed garden, and I've got a bunch of different examples here of how different things go to seed. I brought so many aphids into the office. It's awesome. These are dry, crispy brown kale seeds. And so you can see these are totally ready to harvest. They're already popping out seeds. Half of the pods are already open, which means that there's seeds all over the farm. That's really what it means. But you can see those black, shouldn't do it right over here. You can see those black little hard round seeds are just ready to go. So what I would do with these ones is take them all out of their pods. I'd put them in a container, not something with holes because they're so tiny, and I would let them sit open, airing out, open paper bag, somewhere where they can continue to air out, even though this is totally dry, just to make sure that any last little bit of moisture is totally gone from those seeds. I don't want to mix these up with anything else. Just to see, I was just picking random different things today that are going to seed. This, do you know what this is? It's not quite totally mature yet. Cilantro. It is cilantro. So this was, well, it's cilantro and it will soon be coriander when it's actually dry, which I love. These ones are not quite mature yet. They're still, the plant is clearly dying back, but they're still green. The stalks aren't crispy, so this is actually too early for it to harvest. If you have to harvest before something is totally dry, like you're heading into the end of September, there's rain in the forecast, you know it's never going to dry out again, you can take it like this. I would just hang it upside down and just let it dry out totally that way, and just, you know, that kind of forces the, and if you can pull the whole plant out with the roots still attached, then chances are it can get that last little bit of, that burst of energy that it needs to totally finish off. So if you need to cheat a little, you can. And often, you know, you're coming to the end of September and things are, you know, the weather is starting to turn and things
well, if you're
get...
going to eat it too.
Yeah, exactly.
Mold on it isn't so nice.
Yeah, exactly. So getting it out. And that's another reason why you don't always want to wait till the end of the season to the, you know, to save the last peas, because, well, peas, obviously they're going to be ready in the middle of the summer, but to save the last of everything, because if they don't have time to completely finish and dry out, then you risk not getting any seed at all. So they need enough time to be able to complete their cycle. Now, chard is this is a biennial plant, so typically it will go to seed in its second season rather than in the first season. We've had a bunch of stuff that has gone to seed in the first season for some reason this year, but so this looks obviously very different than a typical chard plant that you would see in your garden, but you can get a sense of what that plant's process is. This is obviously, again, immature, but you can see where that seed is going to be forming on that lovely chard plant.
It's not the...
They're almost like little
nodule
fruit.
Here?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and they will form into little. Do I have somewhere? So the finished chard seed is they're very closely related to beets, and each one of these is actually like a dried little fruit, and each one of these will produce several plants. And so what you see starting to form are these little fruits.
Oh, so they're a little perfect. Never looked at one. They're a perfect flower.
Yeah. I also, just because you don't ever really see this, carrot. That also should be biennial, and it's going to flower. And so that's in the Umbellifera family, so very closely related to like Queen Anne's lace. Great for ladybugs and attracting beneficial insects. Not so great for the carrot. So you can see like that's not a delicious carrot, but carrots are also very hard to save seed from because they're rampant crossers and they'll cross with a whole bunch of different things. So, but you can see the difference in the normal carrot that would just have a little stalk and the carrot going to seed. I hate it when your carrots go to seed before you get to eat them. But carrots are another example of a plant that you couldn't save the seed from and eat the carrot. So you have to make that choice between whether you're eating it. And then this one came from a leek. Also not sure why it's going to seed right now. It's a year where things are going to seed. But this will have a beautiful flower and like an allium flower similar to an onion and all of those things in the allium family. And again, the leek is not terribly delicious once this starts to happen. They get really woody, and there you go, leeks going to flower, reproducing.
Do leeks cross-pollinate quite easily, or are they pretty sure?
I'm not sure. But I can let you know. I'm not sure. We'll figure that one out. Who knows? Somebody knows. It's just not me at this particular moment. Okay, so there are a number of steps. So we already started talking again. So your seed garden is going to look pretty different than your regular vegetable garden that you're producing all of this green, bountiful, because you want it to dry out. You essentially are aiming for a dead, brown, dry, crispy garden, which is sort of hard for some gardeners to adjust to because it looks very aesthetically different. And this looks kind of like a ugly garden, but when you look a little bit more closely, all of those sunflowers that you might have cut off and used in your garden are actually producing sunflower seeds. And all of those beautiful flowers, you're aiming for them to be dead and dry as quickly as possible. So it's again, thinking about when you're designing your garden, if you're wanting to save seeds, thinking about knowing what it's going to look like, knowing that it has to die and be brown and dead in your garden and that's okay, and thinking about how you're planting things and how you're going to harvest them so that you can make sure that you're getting to both eat some and save some for seed. So just thinking about those things as you're planting. So again, I can't say this enough times because many things look very similar and you're going to get totally different plants out of it. Again, tomatoes. So you can see when I was talking about labeling, if you just want to save some seeds from some of the plants. So this was on a farm and in the tomato hoop house, and so we would just go through and identify early on the clusters of tomatoes that were looking really good as seed, and we would label them and give everyone the threat, like don't harvest. If it has a pink label, you're not allowed to harvest it. Now I've got crunchy little things all over the floor. Again, often, with seed companies, they need to know where things are coming from, the year that you saved it from. All of that is really key information. So as much as you can include, I should update my photos because clearly it's no longer 2007. And this was actually seed saved for use in 2007. So harvesting, again, we talked about the peppers. You would want to wait for the nice, ripest, most ready peppers rather than harvesting the immature fruit. So again, leaving it on as long as possible, choosing the ripest fruit. Brown is best. So you can see that, this is what you, typically if you're planting edamame, this is what you're aiming for, and if you're saving the seed, this is what you're aiming for. So those two things are very different. But when you're a seed saver, that's very exciting. And then again, for things like beans, leaving those on the plant, letting them totally finish and mature and become as brown and crispy as possible. So these are just all sorts of random photos. Way too many. The mature seed. So drying, we already talked about making sure that everything is nice and dry, and at every stage letting it sit out for a little bit of time is a really good idea. Sorry, this is just a lot of random photos of people processing seed. But you can see all of these are different varieties of tomato seed. So they've gone through the fermentation process that we talked about earlier, and then they're spread out on screen so that they can dry. And each variety has its own label, so you're always clear about what you've got. You can dry them on paper towels or screens or whatever you've got. So threshing. Now threshing, I should have a picture of your amazing threshing machine. A little lower tech, and
Yeah, but that looks more effective than the swimming pool idea, for sure.
this is
There's
pretty,
some friction there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just a plywood box with little strips in the bottom, and you essentially just put your headphones on and dance in the box for a while. It works really well for beans and peas if you've got a lot and you're trying to get them out. It's really effective, and so basically it's separating the pods and from the seeds, and then you can winnow them, which is hard with big heavy pods sometimes and there's no wind, but you can manufacture wind. So you see all those beautiful pictures, the African women tossing up the grain, and what they're doing there is all of the seed of the whatever it is that they're saving is heavy, and the chaff and the stuff you want to get rid of is light, so it blows off, and that you can separate that way. With, we live in the city, so you've got your couple of buckets. A fan set up can work really well depending on the size of seed that you're saving. More or less wind. You need more or less wind depending on what it is that you're trying to work with. If you have a lot of wind and you're trying to separate lettuce seed, it's all going to disappear. But if you've got a lot of wind and you've got something heavy like beans, it's going to be a lot easier. So sometimes you can manufacture wind with a lid or a frisbee or whatever you've got, and pouring from one bucket to the other and just getting rid of all that extra stuff. And that'll leave you with nice clean seed. You always want to, so this is a really great example, and we were talking about that earlier. Once you've got that nice clean seed, you always want to go through it before you put it away and look for any imperfections. So this one has the outer skin, the seed coat is cracked, and that, we don't want it, so we'll get rid of that one. And you want to look through for any seeds that have any kind of imperfections like that, and you will cull the seeds that look different, the seeds that are small and wrinkly and shriveled, that are off color, that look like they might be of a different variety. If they don't look vigorous, get rid of them. If they're a weird size, get rid of them. So you just want to make sure that you're keeping the good ones. I'm dropping that. And going through, sometimes you'll see insect damage, get rid of those, because if you have an insect that's inside one of your seeds and you store it with every other seed, they're going to be like, yeah, like total buffet. No, you'll open up the bag in the spring and everything will be gone.
Can I share a funny story about
Yes.
that? Sorry, I said peek behind your head. So I did that with my beans last year, and then I happened to pick up my jar in the spring, and I was like, ooh, my beans! And it was writhing with beetles. It was disgusting. It was awful. And every single bean had been totally cored out. Like there was just this weird little shell. Yeah. So I've heard people talking about putting
That's never
the
happened
seed
to me.
in the freezer just for a little bit to kill
Yep.
off any bugs, and then you can take it out again.
Yeah.
Now then there's a moisture thing. maybe,
Yeah.
but is that a good idea?
I mean, generally, I don't tend to do that, but probably mostly because my freezer is always too full and I'm really lazy. I tend to just kind of look through, do a really good cull, make sure that, particularly with things like beans and peas, usually you can tell if there's a pest in there, you can see the evidence of it. It might be a good thing to do if you're like, I think there's something in here. If you can't be sure that you got it all out, then yeah, that might be a good something to do. Sometimes people will store their seeds in the freezer, but the things that seeds want when you're storing them, there's a couple of things. Consistent temperature, preferably cool, dark, and dry. Those are sort of the essential ingredients to happy seed that you're saving. So a really nice spot to store seed is, like, nobody has this, but in a nice fridge somewhere, you know, I have a lot of seeds, I can never fit them in a fridge. Oh, dark, cool, dry, and consistent temperature. So the thing that seeds really struggle with is that warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. That's really hard on them, and they will suffer. So if you can keep them at a nice, cool temperature, I tend not to recommend storing them in the freezer, because I think when you're taking them out and you're planting them and you're sorting through them, they're going through those temperature extremes, and so it seems to be more consistent if you can just keep them nice and cool. I know lots of seed savers will store them just somewhere like a nice cool, if they have a cool closet in their house, or somewhere dark and, you know, under the bed if it's not too hot, or depending on how hot you keep your house. But in the fridge can be a really good spot as long as there's not too much moisture. That's just something to be aware of. If you're using Ziploc bags, there's some protection from moisture, so then that can work. Beware of paper bags. Are a fabulous way. I love storing seeds in paper bags, but they, particularly if you have small seeds, the bottoms are not always totally reliable, and then suddenly you have tiny little seeds everywhere, and over time the glue of the paper bags will come apart, and sometimes then you have just like a seed explosion, and all of your careful labeling and time and energy has been thrown out the window. So often, you can I used to have a big system of just plastic containers, and I would have things in labeled bags, in containers, and just kind of keeping everything really separate. Glass can work as well. You just have to be wary of breaking and then having glass in your seeds, and if you're going to store them in glass, because plastic sucks in so many ways, just be really careful not to break it, because then you may lose your seed as well.
What about those little desiccant things you get with products? Is that a good idea to keep in with that?
I am always wary. I don't really know what those are, and they always make me think that they're, do you know what they're made out of?
I think they're just silica gels.
Are they?
They're just silica.
Okay. Which is,
you wouldn't want to eat it, but
no.
If
but
you don't have little kids
moisture
who are going to go and get into it or something,
I have little kids.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that thing creeps me
you
out.
wouldn't really want them to come and eat your seed either.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, totally. I would go for it. I've never used them, but only because I try and make sure that when my seed is going away, it's really dry. Even if you're just out in the garden and you're planting seed and you get your seed package wet and you put that back into your storage, you have to be really careful and conscious about stuff like that, because even that amount of water can really, mess with things. So as long as you're really careful about making sure everything's dry when it goes in, and that shouldn't be too much of a concern. But if there is moisture in there, then if you're worried about it, then that may be a good solution for sure. I've never used them, but only because I'm skeptical.
Are you going to talk about stratification later, or?
No, I wasn't going to, but
What needs it and what doesn't need it, but.
Yeah, I wasn't going to, and I don't know if I could give you a good answer without reviewing my notes.
Starting.
Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah, you could draw the line at that.
Yeah.
It kind of comes back to storage, though.
Yeah. I haven't done that much at all. Have you?
Well, the only thing is trying to start, particularly things like daisies and like globe thistles and things like that.
Yeah.
It seems like they do so much better if you plant them in the fall.
Yeah.
And
that's
presumably because they do need that winter cycling.
And like garlic is a typical example.
Yeah.
I would tend to just plant things in the fall rather than some people will put them in the freezer and take. I don't have the attention span and ability, you know, it's easier
Yeah,
to
so
just
I don't
plant
know
them in
how
the
many
fall.
vegetables need that, but I know that whole composite family seems to
Yeah.
benefit from it, which makes me think maybe sunflowers would, because they're in the same plant family. But I
No.
don't know, so you can
Because sunflowers, yeah, no, I don't think it's
'Cause I've
family
actually had
specific.
the sunflowers that seed themselves do fantastic.
Yeah.
The ones that I save don't always do that great.
Huh.
They don't always
So maybe it is. Have you done it?
No, I know I had, they're all volunteers in my garden this year,
Yeah.
and they're doing great, but
Yeah.
I don't grow sunflowers all that often.
We should do an experiment, plant a bunch in the fall and see how.
It depends on the winter
Yeah,
too.
I mean,
Yeah,
maybe not a
totally,
bad
yeah.
winter.
So definitely, I mean,
Yeah.
definitely garlic is the big
Yeah,
one.
but
and
that's,
that, you
it's
know,
a bulb, like it's
yeah,
like any
it's a-
bulb, it's not really kind of like a seed
Yeah.
process, it's a,
I don't really
yeah.
think in a annual vegetable kind of sense there's a whole lot.
Yeah, I think maybe it's more flowers.
Yeah,
And I used to
and-
do a lot
and
of flower
flowers.
sorting.
I don't do flowers.
Yeah.
I have to ask the flower experts. I'm like a flower idiot.
I think they need that, but yeah.
There are definitely some. I know,
But I'm not
like,
even sure that the that just having the dry seed cold would do
Right.
the job. I
Right,
think you
you have to
actually
have-
have to have a moist stage where it gets cold.
yeah. No, I'm not going to talk about it. I can talk about
Okay.
it intelligently.
We'll
so
move on.
we'll move on from there.
Storage.
So different. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can store a seed. I always like the Doomsday Seed Vault, which is what they built in. Where is it? Iceland or
Yeah, something like
Greenland or somewhere cold, and that actually is a super deep freeze where it's like a repository for thousands and thousands of varieties of plant. Should anything happen, and you know we go there to get it. So you can freeze seed, but certainly it's not necessary. And really, as long as you're carefully labeling everything, it doesn't really matter what your seed storage system looks like. We tend to store seeds in totes or containers because we have a lot of them. And I'm looking at that box of seeds over your shoulder, which is embarrassing because right now it's September and it's been rifled through all year and it's just like a mountain of seeds that is not well sorted and you know
And not well labeled.
and well labeled, but certainly you can use all sorts of different kinds of containers. Some people like sort of film canister styles. People don't use film anymore, so you don't even, and they tend to be, there's a lot of weird chemicals in film, but plastic containers, depending on what kind of volume you're looking at, you can reuse a lot of materials and turn them into your seed storage system without buying a lot of things. But paper bags or Ziploc bags and containers of whatever sort you have work really well. I think that was all the main things that I was going to talk about, but if you guys have questions or if I missed anything that you're dying to know about.
I have a question about potatoes again. They
Yeah.
sometimes get a little fruit on top.
Yep.
And is that where they originally make seed potato from, or
No,
or can
so
you grow a potato?
yeah,
from
you
that?
can. So it's very similar to garlic. So when you think about garlic reproducing, you get there are certain plants that have multiple strategies for reproducing. So garlic, for example, you plant your clove and you get a bulb at the bottom, but if you let the flower develop and mature, you'll get the little bulbules at the top, and which are like tiny little mini garlic. And those are just two different ways that garlic plant can reproduce. So it has multiple strategies. And so with potatoes, it's the same thing. You don't always get those, but yes, you could grow them from there. But seed potatoes are regular potatoes that don't have any diseases and those sorts of things. But they don't tend to be from them because they're so little. I feel like I missed things, but I don't know what.
You were going to talk about, well, I guess you did with the peas.
Oh, right.
But,
Oh, yeah, culling.
so those were nasturtiums
Right.
and they're kind of loose on the outside of the nasturtium plant. So,
I don't know if you can see this.
so I picked them up off the ground.
So we've
And
got.
a few were falling off the plant green.
So you can see here that there is a whole lot of different. Sit down here. There's a whole lot of different. When you're culling this, there's some really nice big, nice dry plants, and then there's some really kind of piddly, little, shrivelly, not very healthy looking specimens. And so I would take out all of those gross little ones and just keep the really nice, uniform looking plants. So you want to have a pile that looks more like that, more uniform, and less full of things like that's not going to be a happy, healthy nasturtium. So when you're culling, just making sure that you want to get rid of. Like we like to celebrate diversity and difference, but not in this world or context. So just take out all those gross little ones. And this is a fabulous thing to be doing in the fall or in the winter, sitting in front of a movie or a nice cup of tea, just don't spill it on your seeds. And it's sort of a nice therapeutic kind of easy evening inside activity, which can be very satisfying. And it's nice, you want that nice clean pile of seeds. You also want to make sure when you're preparing seeds for storage that you're getting all of the dirt out, all of the little bits of anything left over, and so that you've got nice clean seed, because any of that extra like chaff or plant matter or anything that can harbor insects and diseases. So you want to make sure that it's as clean as possible and that you've removed all of that extra stuff so that there will be less of a chance that there will be any of those pests and diseases in your seed for next year. And these, you were asking about these because some of them you were picking up right off the ground.
Well, and some of these, like, I'm pretty sure these bigger, whiter ones would have been almost more green. Yeah, because they sort of form on the outside they form a little triplet on the outside of the nasturtium.
Yeah. And some of these were still.
And some of them, most of the ones that were brown when I got them were on the ground, so they're dirty. They were dirty.
Yeah, and dirty, like for these, it's not so, they're hard to clean. You don't want to wash them. You never want to, if you have dirty seed, you don't want to add water, because with the exception of tomatoes, which are just about the only seed that you would ever add water to, you don't want to clean them in that way. But certainly, there's some loose dirt that's come off. There's a little bit in the bag. So just trying to get as much off as possible. And if there's seeds that are really like dirty, and there's dirt, just trying to get it off as best you can.
These are hard to even tell if there's a bug or. Yeah. But I can't say that I've ever bought nasturtium seeds that were any cleaner than that.
Yeah, no, and nasturtiums I would say are, they're not going to be perfect, but this pile is a lot cleaner than this pile.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the general rule.
With those peas that you don't know which is which, can you sort of tell a little bit? Because some are white and some are dark green and some are sort of round and some are bumpy.
Yeah.
So some were not completely dry on the plant. That kind of thing going on.
So
these
hang on,
ones.
Yeah, this is what the mildew I was talking about on the pod. Should you continue to dry that pod out and save it, or
you can see what it's like, see what the seed's like. If it just affects the pod, that's fine. If there's any mildew on the seed, and you'll be able to tell when you have them all in a bowl, they'll look different if they're
So
they're
these.
mildewy.
So when I did these, all of them were this shape.
right?
So that makes me think they were sugar snaps, except that most of them were lovely round
Yeah.
tan colored ones, and some were lovely round green colored ones,
Right.
and some were wrinkly green colored ones.
Squared, yeah.
And this is the question: do we give up on the green seed in here? Do we just take that out? We maybe should take the wrinkly ones out, from what you're saying.
Well, they're just a different variety.
Yeah,
There's
there's varieties that are like
yeah,
that.
and so I think it's just a variety issue. It's not a.
So there might be multiple sugar snap types
Yeah.
in here.
Yeah.
And then there's the snows, and the snows, I think these deeper ones are the snows. And that one probably wasn't fully ripe either, because I can tell it's not. But they're green, and they're round, green round. So I feel like maybe the green, so do we take a chance and put the green ones in as possible snows? And like, this is how I labeled that. EGP, likely sugar snaps, previously saved seeds that were mixed snow and snap. So we know that there's a risk. They're going to be a mixture.
Yeah.
You know, because, I mean, Emily's saying we were short on pea seeds, and
Yeah.
But
wouldn't
still
we rather have mixed peas than no peas?
Then no peas. Yeah.
So,
Or-
but still, snow and snap peas, you still eat the whole thing.
Yeah, it
Just
was
one
a bit of a
spot.
hassle
They're just
for
harvesting
picking because
Yeah,
they were
I know.
completely
Challenging
mixed. Like
yeah,
they were.
it's not like
our
it's shelling
trellis
peas
was
and
mixed.
snap. Those
Yeah.
are horrible.
And it's not like it's snow peas next to snap peas. They're like,
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and sometimes it was hard to tell if it was a baby snap
yeah, it
pea
was
or
not
a nice
mature.
little snow pea.
yeah.
So the other thing, I guess you could do is you could take all the white ones out,
And then
Green
you
colored
Plant
ones.
them.
And then-
take all the green ones
group them.
out, and put them in two different beds, and put all the square ones out and put them in different beds. The ones you're not sure about, what
Get
I
rid
do
of
with them is I use them as a cover crop for the winter.
Oh yeah.
So you're not wasting
or
it
you
as
could
such, but
or
you're
you
not-
could just do or sprouts,
Yeah.
which we could just do a quick little fall crop of bean
Sprouts,
sprouts or something.
Peas, yeah.
And take what we know.
Shoots,
I mean,
yeah.
I know that is a sugar snap pea. I'm sure, because
Mm.
based on the shape and the sugariness, I could tell in the,
Yeah.
in the hulls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a trick, and I think you could do an experiment and see,
Yeah, I mean, you
separate
could
them all
plant
out and
but
plant
that's-
them in different.
Chances of me taking good notes on that are very low.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
You know,
That's,
even though
I think,
I'm
the
a
hardest.
scientist, like even though my scientific mind should be more organized,
Yeah.
I do that for my day job.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
For labeling things, if you're using something like a wooden popsicle stick, a pencil is the best thing to write on it with. If you write on it with a ballpoint pen, which seems like it might be a better idea, or even a Sharpie marker, it will often disappear, and then even though you put your best effort into labeling, you're still at square one. So a pencil on a wooden stake works really well. And if you're ever writing things with a Sharpie, always use a black Sharpie. If you want it to, those stay the longest. Colored
And
ones
then
don't.
write it down in a book.
Write it down. in the
Which
book.
bed you put the things
Yes,
into, just
totally.
in case.
As many
Everything
places
gets
as
lost.
possible.
The birds move them, all kinds of things.
Yeah, totally.
So do you have maps?
Yeah.
You really do. Oh, you're a real pro.
Mm.
I'm just an amateur. And this is the
Very
difference. No, it is
strict
the
with
difference.
the labeling.
Yeah.
It's very important to me.
Every year, like, I do that. I pick those. I'm sure I know where my arugula is and where my kale is, and
Yeah.
they look identical when they're like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's funny
I know
because
which one was
because for some people it's more important. Like for me with kale, I don't actually really care if it has crossed and it's sort of like half two varieties of kale. Like I don't care, it's edible, it's kale, like fine. That's you know, I'll eat it anyways. But some like if you know that you want lacinato kale and that's the only kale that you want, then you have to be a little bit more strict about the labeling. If you're flexible about what you're harvesting, you can be more flexible about what you're labeling.
Yeah.
So I have a question, and I'm not going to name names because we're on film, but if this particular seed company,
Yeah.
has anyone experienced maybe not getting what they thought they were going to get? Because I have.
I think with all
Varieties.
seed companies, sometimes there's some
There's a
quality
slip up.
control
Yeah.
issues. And has it happened a lot more frequently?
I'm pretty sure I got a completely different squash than I thought.
I've heard that complaint as well, but I think it can happen.
I mean, I love them,
sometimes.
so I
yeah,
just-
and yeah, but it's surprising when you get something that is incorrectly labeled. And when you're thinking about the seed industry, there are a lot of steps and there are a lot.
I know.
Of, you know, it's
I mean,
amazing
I totally
that.
could understand. It
Yeah.
says something about, well, real people were doing this, not machines or something like that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Or maybe it was a
Yeah.
machine.
And really, I still have a squash, so it's okay.
Yeah. So sometimes, I always feel like, cut them some slack because I would be just as likely to do that as they are and mislabel something and give it to someone and say, this is a whatever.
Okay, I just wondered
totally
if
something, but
if,
but definitely if you get something and it's totally wrong, let them know.
Yeah.
Because they're never going to catch it if they don't know, and we're so likely to catch those mistakes and just be angry about it and not, or be irritated and not tell them. But if they don't know, they can't fix it, right? So their business is to make sure that things are what they say they are. So if they're slipping up, then it's important to make sure that they know, because they'll usually.
No, I mean I'm very sympathetic because I'm not very good at labeling. But these weren't me.
Yeah, totally.
These peas. So.
I would just get rid of the rest of those.
I think so.
And the thing about I would err on the side, like if you're like, should I keep this or should I not? Just get rid of it. Like it doesn't. Okay. It's not worth risking your whole seed for one like iffy little.
Yeah. So I'm not. Yeah. I'm thinking it's not the vibe. Yeah. It's if they all went bad, that would be bad.
Yeah, that's worse than. Than
I was thinking they just wouldn't germinate or something, which isn't a big deal.
Yeah, and if you're interested in knowing, like often people will be uncertain about how viable their seed is, and you can do a really simple germination test and just I like multiples of 10, take 10 seeds, wrap them in a moist paper towel, stick them on the top of your fridge in a plastic bag, and see how many germinate. And if you've got 8 that germinate, you've got 80% germination rate. And that, if you're worried about seed saving over time, because often seed companies will only sell seed for 1 year. So they grow it 1 year, they sell it the next year, and they can no longer sell it. Like they're not allowed. So people often think, sorry, I'm wasting your precious mixed pea seed. People will often think
someone will throw them in a bag and give them.
Yeah, totally.
Next year.
Totally. I'm gonna just label this like something weird and then send it to you. People will think that they can only grow the seeds for 1 year, but if you store them well and store them somewhere nice and dry and cool, they'll be viable for a long time. And there's archaeological sites that have successfully germinated seeds that have been in archaeological sites for 300 years or 1,000 years, and it will still grow. So given the right conditions, they had recovered some from a marine, like a shipwreck. And they managed to grow them, and because they hadn't been
in a sealed container.
They were sealed, and the seeds were wet, but they hadn't
no light,
no oxygen. So then when they brought them up, they were able to grow them. Yeah, so they can remain viable for a really long time, and they're pretty incredible. But, so you don't have to grow them out every year. But you can, if you've had the seed for a few years and you're trying to figure out how many to grow, you can do a quick germination test and say, oh, there's only 50% viability. I'll just... I was working with one kind of seed at a time is probably also a good idea. And you can then you just know that you plant twice as many seeds, and it's not a big deal. It's not going to impact the health of the plant.
But things like tomatoes, one tomato's got a bazillion seed in it, really. And that next year, you really only want to sow about 2 or
and that's the thing about saving seed. You're gonna have a lot of seed. If you start saving seed, you're going to have a lot, and don't feel bad about throwing it out. You're gonna want to save tomatoes from a couple of plants, and that means you're gonna have a lot of tomato seed. So if you only end up keeping a few from each plant, like that's fine. Put them all together, keep a few. Don't feel like obligated that you must grow every seed out. Like it's okay if you don't use them all, you can give them to your neighbors. But seed saving, you will always, one lettuce plant will produce thousands and thousands and thousands of seed, and chances of you growing.
Would you call him? Not so good except for that one.
Yeah, I would call him.
Yeah.
He's got a little tiny
too,
split.
That has a little tiny hole.
Yeah, and that seed coat is what protects the seed. So if it's
so, it would be devastating to lose them all after all that work. But
there you go. I have a little cull basket here. So there you go. Anything else that I missed in that?
No, that was good.
Very good.
Really good.
Awesome. There you go. Seed saving.
Because I've been doing this for a while, but it's so sad to have to get
The books that I would recommend, I want to get the titles right. I might just employ Google, or you've got Google. Oh, perfect.
Oh.
Seed to Seed by it's an excellent resource, and it will give you all of the lists of the Latin names of all of the different varieties, so you can figure out if it's a cross-pollinating plant, what it will cross with.
Ashworth.
Ashworth. Suzanne Ashworth, Seed to Seed. And there's another book, if you're really wanting to get into the saving seed from hybridized plants or hybridizing your own varieties. So those are great resources.